Good evening. Welcome to the first of the UFM Lou Douglas lectures of the fall semester, and thank you for coming in spite of the fact that there were some important ball games going on tonight. We'll be out soon. We'll be out long before they're over. You know, the Royals always go into overtime. This is a special lecture series at K-State. It honors Professor Lou Douglas, who was a professor of political science until his death in 1977. Lou was widely known for his power to interact with students, faculty, and the community, and really engage them in issues to think about grassroots organizations, about how grassroots operations function, looking at human rights, social justice kinds of issues. And our lecture series attempts to address those at least once or twice during the year to help be true to the kinds of things that Lou stood for. I think you're going to enjoy our lecture tonight. It will be, I think, by most standards, rather informal. Please think of questions because our speaker would love to answer questions. But we ask that you come down here to one of the microphones to ask your question, and that way everybody gets to hear it. It's also being recorded so that then the questions and the answers will be on the video as well. And our video will be available on the K-State website as soon as they can get it processed and uploaded for us. Also, after the lecture, there'll be a book signing back in the back. You may have seen the books there as you came in. So please consider that and take a minute to interact with Jeffrey Hollender because he's a very interesting and really approachable sort of a person. If you have to leave before the book signing and before the question and answer, please do so quietly. So that others can participate. Oftentimes the question and answer is the most interesting part of the lecture. No offense, Jeffrey. Because you get to really interact and get the questions answered that you are interested in. And that's a unique thing that we try to maintain with the Lou Douglas Lecture Series. So with that, I do want to let you know that our lecture tonight is co-sponsored with the College of Business Administration's Ethics Education Initiative and also the Provost Education Excellence Fund. So thank you to both of those groups who helped make this lecture possible. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Diane Swanson. She's a professor in the Department of Management in the College of Business Administration, and she will be introducing our speaker. Diane.
Thank you for that. I want to echo what Linda just said about Jeffrey Hollender and how approachable he is and how he loves to answer questions because Mr. Hollender came to my class this afternoon in the College of Business. It's a class on corporate citizenship and corporate social responsibility. And he immediately opened up the discussion to questions from students, and my students asked him a lot of questions, a lot of good questions, and the engagement between Mr. Hollender and the students was really very good. I was jealous of it because I usually don't get that kind of response to my lectures, but he came in and right away engaged the students, talking about corporate social responsibility. And one student asked Mr. Hollender if there's an example of a perfect corporation out there. And his answer was very telling. He's a co-founder of Seventh Generation, a company that produces sustainable consumer products. He's founded and run a lot of other organizations, served on boards, is an adjunct professor in New York City. He knows from experience that there's no such thing as a perfect company, and he explained to students that it's about having a vision and getting better and keeping an eye on minimizing the negative impacts. And all throughout the talk, the sense of community mindedness and serving society and serving community and being motivated by that came through very strongly. And there are many of us in the College of Business who believe that the role of business in society should be about serving the greater good. I read Mr. Hollender's book, The Responsibility Revolution and the Future of Business. It's full of good examples about businesses that have pursued corporate social responsibility and the challenges and the opportunities. I found it very, very interesting. So Mr. Hollender is here to speak tonight on this important subject. The field of corporate social responsibility in academia is decades old, but we absolutely have to hear from a visionary like Mr. Hollender to know how it's actually put into practice. So please help me welcome Mr. Jeffrey Hollender, extraordinary social entrepreneur.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here tonight. Again, I just appreciate that you're taking time away from the baseball game to be here. I hope I can provide some competitive entertainment. It's also interesting to be here in Kansas at this particular time. Kansas has, as you well know, a very interesting relationship with business and has some very powerful business interests that are in your state. You also are coming up to a very important election that may have a huge influence over the rest of the country, and I hope that all of you are registered and will be planning on voting, because your vote may have a much bigger impact this year than you could imagine. So I'm going to talk about 6 different topics, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of context about my background, and so you can sort of understand where I'm coming from. I want to touch briefly on the question of what is a responsible business, because I think that there is a tremendous amount of confusion about what qualifies a business to be responsible. Briefly about the sort of moral and ethical crisis that I think is facing business, the business case for being responsible. I'll touch on a couple of examples of businesses that I think are doing corporate responsibility particularly well, and then finish by talking about 10 things that business must do to have a positive impact on the world. That sounds like a lot to cover. I will talk quickly because it's a big landscape. And I hope, as was said before, while I'm speaking, please think about where you disagree with me, where you want to challenge me, where you want more information, because I agree that the opportunity to answer your questions is probably the most important part of the evening. So since I've been 19, I dropped out of college, started my first company. I'm now, I think, on my 5th business. So I have spent my entire life as a businessman. At the same time that I have been focused on running a business, I have also been on the board of Greenpeace. I was recently the chair of the Greenpeace board, and I started an organization called the American Sustainable Business Council, which is something to pay attention to if you're interested in business. It's about 300,000 small and medium-sized companies who are challenging the Chamber of Commerce around everything from climate change to minimum wage. And it's a bright light in terms of developments within the business community. And I still do a little bit of consulting with large companies like Kimberly-Clark and Morgan Stanley. And I do that because it's important when I stand up here and criticize business, which I do a lot, that I not only speak from the experience of running a business, but also having had the benefit of understanding the challenges that some of these very large companies have. So just a note about Seventh Generation, I'm probably most known as the founder of Seventh Generation, and I spent the last 22, 23 years growing that business. And there's a lot to be proud of in what Seventh Generation accomplished. Is the sound okay? Yeah. You know, we created some good products. We gave away 10% of our profits to different NGOs. We were deeply committed to employee ownership. Every year we gave 1% of the ownership of the company to our employees. I had, and all the senior management had, salary caps. So compared to the average Fortune 500 company, where the spread between the lowest paid person and the highest paid person is about 500 to 1, we had salary caps that were 17 to 1. So we voluntarily limited how much we made. And I'll tell you that your perspective on people's income is very different than when your salary is tied to their salary. You become a lot more interested in raising what the lowest paid people make when that's the only way you can raise your own salary. But there were a lot of places in which we fell short. And it's true that there is no perfect business, and most businesses are probably more imperfect than we are aware of. Probably one of the most important things is that while Seventh Generation and Ben & Jerry's and The Body Shop and Patagonia were great exceptions to the rules, at the end of the day, if we don't change the rules, business will continue as it has for the most part. And that's one of my reflections, and one of the reasons that I got involved in the American Sustainable Business Council was because I realized that we need to change the rules, and that will be something that we talk about this evening. Secondly, the paradigm of Seventh Generation products was to make products that were better than traditional products, but nevertheless, unfortunately, were not what I would consider good products. They were products that were less bad. So I don't think you can have a good paper towel. A paper towel is a product you use for a few seconds and throw away. It takes energy, it takes water to create it. And we say, if you've ever read the label of our paper towels, use a cloth towel wherever possible, because it's not a good thing to use a paper towel. So that was a challenge. And so, you know, in my life, I'm lucky to have another opportunity with my new business to try to do better this time. The goal of my new company, Sustain, which is the first non-toxic, fair trade, sustainably produced condom in the world, is to really have a company that is a net positive company, so that rather than being less bad, we can actually have a positive effect on the world. And we chose condoms, and this is, you know, this is not only a father-daughter business, but it's a family business. So we get, you know, probably most of the interviews that the media does with us is, what is it like to sell condoms with your dad? They want to know from my daughter's perspective. But the reason we got into the condom business is because when I think about products that are essential, I know this is like a funny thing. It took me a long time to get used to talking about condoms, because it's not, you know, it's not something that you are often that comfortable with. And it was a lot easier for me to sort of be a toilet paper salesman than it has been a condom salesman. I mean, when I you know, there's not a lot of kids that are, when they're growing up, they say, I want to sell condoms. And you know, it wasn't that I want to sell condoms, it was that I really saw condoms as one of the very few products that are truly essential to society. Because when you help manage the growth of population, you're having a huge positive impact on managing climate change, because the growth of the population is a huge driver of climate change. Smaller families, helping women manage the size of their families, leads to less hunger and better education. having a fair trade product means that we're improving the wages of everyone working in the rubber fields. So we were able to create a very little product that has a relatively small negative impact, but has lots and lots of positive impacts. And again, my mission is to create a model of what that net positive business looks like. We also, of course, give 10% of our profits away to women's reproductive health care. And one of the things that's unusual is that we decided that we would start a condom company marketing condoms to women. Every condom company in the market is marketing to men. We wanted to focus on helping women feel comfortable and empowered about buying condoms, and then also insisting that they're used. So women in the audience, and usually this is my daughter speaking, not me. You don't want to hear your dad telling you this, but don't depend upon a guy to show up with a condom. You should be the one that is prepared. So anyway, that's why she's the spokesperson of the company. So I'm going too slow, but let me jump into the second question. And the second question, what is a responsible business? And one of the ways I think about this is if all of you were the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So let's just say, you're the CEO of Exxon and you're the CEO of, Shell. And I asked the question, raise your hand if you're running a responsible business. How many hands would go up? Well, 500 hands would go up because all of these, mostly guys, very few women, think in their own mind that they're running a responsible business. And that's in part because we really don't have a good definition of what it means to be a responsible business. B corporations are probably the closest that we come to an institutional definition of what a responsible business is. But let me tell you my own definition, and my own definition is really guided by 6 principles. First principle is the purpose of the corporation is to harness private interests to serve the public interest, okay? It's not about making as much money as you can make for your shareholders. One of the reasons that the world is facing so many challenges is that we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of businesses who are just focused on making as much money as they can make. And when you look around, you see the impact that that's having on the world. Corporations shall accrue a fair return for their shareholders, but not at the expense of the legitimate interests of other stakeholders. Corporations shall operate sustainably, meeting the needs of the present generation without adversely affecting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Corporations shall distribute their wealth equitably amongst those who contribute to its creation. If you don't have a business that has employee ownership, I would argue that it's not a responsible business. Responsible business is not just about the environment. It's as much about issues of equity and justice as it is about issues of the environment. And one of the places where we have sort of missed the boat in the world of corporate responsibility is undervaluing issues of equity and justice. Governance is important. Governance must be participatory, transparent, ethical, and accountable. And businesses that are responsible should focus on this idea of being net positive rather than negative. So, next I want to shift and just touch upon, and I could spend all day talking about this, why I think business today is facing a real moral and ethical crisis. And, part of it is even Warren Buffett will write in the New York Times and say, it's a problem that I pay 15% income tax and my secretary pays 35%. Why is it? How did we create a society where the wealthiest people pay the lowest taxes and the poorest people pay the most taxes? It's wrong, it's misguided, and it's not good for our economy. I was talking in the class earlier, and I was saying, why is it that we today live in a society where 1% of our population owns 50% of the wealth. 1%, 1 out of 100 people, those 1% own 50% of all the wealth in the United States. And I was saying that's bad for business and bad for our economy. Now, why would that be bad for business? Why would it be bad for such a small group of people to have so much money? Well, it's bad for business because if you're making $50,000 a year, you spend every penny you make. All of your money, all of your salary goes back into the economy. If you're a hedge fund manager and you're making $4 billion a year, you spend very little of that money. Most of that money escapes to the Bahamas or Switzerland into a bank account and doesn't get recycled back into the economy. So if you have 50% of the wealth that exists in America not being spent, now all that spending creates some environmental problems, but it also creates a lot of missed opportunities to create jobs and build businesses. So we have sequestered half of our wealth and taken it out of the playing field that needs to be in the economy. So it is bad for our economy to have such concentration in wealth. So a couple of other things I want to mention about this challenge. We also have created an environment where business does what is legal, even if it's unethical. And that, to me, is a real challenge. And so one of my favorite stories is about Starbucks. And I was accompanying my daughter to a speech that Howard Schultz gave, who was the CEO of Starbucks. And he was talking about how upset he was that there were demonstrations in front of the Starbucks stores in London. And he said, you know, these people are demonstrating because Starbucks in 10 years has never paid any taxes. And the reason we haven't paid taxes is because we're not profitable. So why should they be upset with us that we're not paying taxes? Well, the reason, does anybody know the reason why Starbucks has never paid taxes in England? Anybody? No? Anyway, well, because what they did is they gave the trademark to a company in Belgium. Belgium has much, much, much lower taxes than England has. So the company in Belgium licenses the Starbucks name to all of the stores in England and sucks all the profits out of England. The profits get realized in Belgium at a lower tax rate. So he designed all of the stores to not make any money because it's more profitable to realize that money in Belgium than it is in England. Now, that's perfectly legal. Nothing illegal about that. The fact that he's surprised people are unhappy about that, that to me is what is truly amazing. And we live in a world where basically the bigger you are and the richer you are, the more opportunities you have to scam the system. Why is it that so many companies, and of course you're dealing with this in your state, you know, you're in a situation where there's lots of companies, or all companies don't have to pay state taxes, but we have companies that pay no taxes, either state or federal. And you know, GE, and I don't want to pick on GE, has not paid more than 5% tax over the last 5 years, and the average small business is paying 35%. Why is that bad? Why is it bad that a small company is paying 35% and a big company is paying 5%? It's bad because they're not paying their fair share. They're not contributing to the fire department. They're not contributing to schools. They're not contributing to highways being built. They're utilizing all of the services that any large company utilizes, and they're shifting the burden of paying for those services onto small companies and individual taxpayers. Now, it's legal, but I think it's immoral. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the world of corporate responsibility is this confusion between playing by the rules, even if it means that you're playing by rules that are truly unacceptable. And what is that sort of translated into? It's translated into, companies are doing pretty well. I mean, they have recently generated the highest profits in the past 60 years. If you're an executive at most of those companies, your taxes have been cut in half since 1970. And the annual income of the wealthiest in this country has gone from about 4 million to about 35 million since 74. So if you are in that 1%, you've seen your income go up from 4 million to 35 million on average. And if you're middle class or lower class, the most recent numbers show that your real income has actually declined over the last 30 years. And that's not a good situation. And the last thing I want to touch on is one of the most important root problems, and that is this question of why is it that good products cost more money than bad products? So you want to go buy organic carrots, or you want to buy a Patagonia jacket. All of the things that we think of are good tend to be more expensive than the things that we think of that are bad. And the reason for that is that we have designed an economic system to make that happen. So if you want to be a good company, you want to internalize and take responsibility for the negative impact you're having on society. So if you are a strawberry grower and you're growing organic strawberries, you're making sure that you don't dump pesticides into the ground and pollute the groundwater. You're making sure that you're not putting pesticides in the air that affect the health of school children living nearby or your workers. That costs more money. If you're growing strawberries in a traditional way, and you're polluting the groundwater or adversely affecting the health of your workers or the community, you as a business don't pay for that. You externalize those negative impacts onto society. And we allow, in fact, even encourage business to do that. And as a result, they're able to sell products at a cheaper price than the good company that's internalizing those costs. Does that make sense? People follow that? Because it's an important concept. So anyway, moving on. One of the things that most people don't realize is that it actually makes economic and financial sense to be responsible. A student asked me today, why would you choose to run a responsible business and make less money than if you were doing something else? Well, the truth is, I've done just fine financially. I have not been hurt by running responsible businesses. I've been very successful financially. Could I have made more money if I didn't cap my salary? Yeah, I could have made more money, but the question that I ask myself is, how much is enough? I have more than enough to live on. So, and there's a lot of other reasons. If you are running a responsible business, you are able to attract better talent and you're able to retain that talent. You are able to build greater consumer loyalty. And if you look at some of the valuations of companies that are thought of as responsible, they're exponentially higher often than companies that are not. It is a great way to protect your biggest asset, which is your reputation. So if you think about the fact that in America, the average business has 75% of its value tied up in intangibles like brand and reputation. The best way to protect that is to be a responsible business. Behave well, treat your workers well, be a good community citizen, don't mess up the environment. So it is another reason why being responsible makes sense. You end up with more dependable supply chains, more dependable material costs, more predictable and consistent profits. And if we want to look at some of the statistics, and there's lots of statistics, and statistics are tricky things. When I was in 8th grade, we had a book called How to Lie with Statistics. And the truth is, you can find a fact to support almost any point of view that you want to take. So you usually want to look at these meta-studies that take 100 or 1,000 pieces of research and aggregate them and sort of see what they say. But one of the things one of the statistics that I like the most is a statistic that comes from Credit Suisse. So you don't think of banks usually as the most responsible, forward-leaning companies, but they did a study of 2,400 businesses, and they tracked their profits and their earnings and everything else since 2005. And they found two things which were quite amazing. That if a business had just one woman on its board instead of none, its net income growth was 40% faster than businesses with no women on its board. And their return on equity was 25% higher. Now, here you take something that would seem, if I was running a business and I heard that statistic, why would you not have more women on your board and in your management or a more diverse company? And yet, in spite of the fact that Credit Suisse does this analysis and comes to the conclusion that having that diversity of perspective in a company and on its board hugely enhances its financial performance, has almost no impact on all these businesses. I mean, when you look at the number of women on the boards of American companies, it's miserable. There are places in Europe where in order to keep your status as a public company, you have to have a minimum of 40% women on your board. I mean, we live in a we think of ourselves as such a forward-thinking country, but we really have many, many, many very backward notions. So, two more things I'm going to touch on before we get to the questions and answers. I want to just touch on some companies that I think are doing the best job being responsible. And when I say responsible, I mean it from a holistic perspective, so it's social issues as well as environmental issues. So one of my favorite companies today is Unilever. And I remember when Unilever took over Ben & Jerry's over a decade ago, they were an evil company who came into Vermont and bought out this wonderful company that everyone in Vermont loved. And over the last decade, largely because of their new CEO, Paul Pullman, they have totally transformed themselves. And they are doing some of the most amazing things that any company in the world is doing. And one of the things that is really the most important and significant is often when we think about the negative impact that a company has on the environment, we do it in a very direct, literal way. So, how much energy or water does the manufacturing plant use? What's the impact of refining the raw materials? And what Unilever has discovered is that the biggest negative impact that most consumer products companies have on the environment is the use of the product. So if you think about shampoo, the use of shampoo, primarily in terms of the water used in the shower and the energy to heat up that water that's used in the shower, is 80% of the negative impact that product has. The manufacturing, the packaging, the raw materials, the ingredients is only about 20%. And Unilever has been brave enough to say, we're going to take responsibility not just for making the product, but for all aspects of how our products are used. And thus, in order to reduce their negative impact, they don't just have to use better raw materials, less packaging. They actually have to change behavior when it comes to how we use shampoos and how we shower. And they realize that these companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever have taught us as consumers all of these terrible habits that now are having a disastrous effect on our climate and our environment. And if they don't play a role in helping change our behavior, we're never going to make progress with things like climate change. Climate change is not about just stopping fossil fuel emissions. It's about the whole way in which our society functions. It's about our system of agriculture. And many would argue that not only do we have to focus on stopping the production of CO2, We have to really focus on getting the CO2 that's already in the environment out of the environment. One of the best ways to do that is through sustainable organic agriculture that actually takes CO2 out of the air and sequesters it back in the soil. So, another great company you might not have heard of is called Kingfisher, which is the European equivalent of Home Depot. Great clothing company, Marks and Spencer in England. I give CVS, although I won't say that everything they do is great, tremendous credit for stopping selling cigarettes. They walked away from $2 billion of revenue. The decision that they made, which says, well, we're in the business of helping people's health, why should we be selling products that kill them at the same time? It's a bold move if you're a CEO to say, we're not going to sell a product that generates $2 billion of revenue. So, last thing that I'm going to touch upon before we go to your questions are 10 things, and I think they're perhaps the 10 most important things business can do to have a more positive impact on the world. First thing may seem a little unusual, but how many people here have ever studied systems thinking? So less than 5%. At 7th Generation, we taught all of our employees systems thinking. And systems thinking is a way of thinking that is focused on the interconnection of things. Mostly what we do when we learn, we go to college, we go to school, is we focus on a single discipline. It could be accounting, it could be the law, it could be marketing, it could be science. And I would argue that we can't understand the world through those compartments. We have to understand the world by understanding the interconnection of all those things. Systems thinking. If we taught systems thinking to everyone in the first grade, we wouldn't do a lot of the crazy things that we do. Talked about becoming a benefit corporation. I think that's a great thing. Compensation practices. We need to increase the minimum wage. It is ridiculous that we live in a country where if you have a full-time job earning the minimum wage, you will live in poverty for your entire life. Why would we set a minimum wage for people so that they would be in poverty and need food stamps and need to depend upon the government for support? We talked about limiting compensation between the lowest and highest paid worker and making employees owners. When we think about corporate responsibility, I think we have to reframe the discussion around this idea of being a net positive company. We have to change the conversation from reducing the negatives and being less bad to what does it mean to be good? I would love to hear your thoughts on what is a good product? What is a good company? Who do you think of when you think of a good product and a good company? You need to build values into the community at work. It's great to have a good CEO, an enlightened CEO, but at the end of the day, to really be a responsible company, those values have to be in the very fabric of the workplace. Companies that are committed to being the best place to work. We used to have an award every week where we celebrated the person that made the biggest mistake because we believed that you don't want to hide mistakes, you want to learn from mistakes. We have our managers evaluated by the people they manage. In order to be a good manager, who would know best but the people that are managed by that person? I also think, and I don't want to confuse this with businesses putting money into politics, because I think that every business should commit to spend no money in political elections. One of the worst things that has happened to our country is that we've disenfranchised voters. When you have an individual who spends $10 million, if not $50 million, influencing elections, how do you convince people that their individual vote matters? We need to get money out of politics. We need to overturn Citizens United. But it doesn't mean that business has no role in public policy. Businesses need to advocate for having higher minimum wage. Businesses need to advocate for us signing a climate change treaty and committing to reduce our CO2 emissions. So we should be involved in public policy, but not in public elections. Sometimes we think that big business is the worst kind of business, and I would argue that that's not the case. There are many things that you can do as a large business that you can't do as a small business. If Walmart decided tomorrow to ban phthalates from personal care products, every company in the world would take phthalates out of them because they all want to sell to Walmart. If Walmart decided that they would only buy fair trade coffee, then there would be nothing in the marketplace other than fair trade coffee. These large companies, if they use their influence in a positive way, they can have an incredibly positive difference. I think that companies need to stand for something. You know, whether it's CVS or Marks and Spencer or Patagonia or Seventh Generation, I think that you have to do more than sell a product. I think you have to stand for something. And the last of the 10 things that I'll focus on is the single most important question that I ask myself and that I ask of my business is, what does the world most need that we are uniquely able to provide? Of all the challenges that are facing the world, where can we uniquely make a contribution, and where can I or you uniquely make a contribution to addressing the challenges that we face? You know, at the end of the day, my generation has made a huge mess of this world. And we've created a mess that we're leaving to you guys to clean up, unfortunately. That's just the facts. And I believe that it's not about technology. It's not about discovering something that we don't already know. We know what's required to fix the challenges that we face. The question is, do we have the will and the willingness to do it? Will all of you commit in some way to having a positive influence on the world? Will you pick something that you're committed to that will ensure that you make a positive difference? The only way that we're going to change the trajectory that we're on is if all of you are committed to being part of the solution. And I don't say as compared to being part of the problem, because no one wants to be part of the problem. No one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to screw up the world today. What can I do to make things worse? No one thinks like that. But unfortunately, there's two choices. Either you're committed to having a positive effect, or whether you want to or not, you're probably going to have a negative effect. It needs to come from your intention. It needs to come from your commitment and your willingness to devote some part of your life to making a difference. You know, you don't all have to be as obsessed as I am and spend all your time doing this stuff, although God knows we need more people like that. So anyway, let's go to some questions. And again, come up to the microphone. And please, there's nothing you can't ask me. So take the opportunity to challenge me, ask whatever you would like. Someone's got to be the first. Someone, you know, there we go. Thank you both.
Hey, do you like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert? Which one, if you had to choose, which one was like?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
It is.
I would go with Stephen Colbert.
Awesome. Thanks.
What, in your opinion, would be the best way for us as a knowledgeable population, which know what a good company should and shouldn't do? What's the best way for us to convince these big corporations who can't see past like their mountains of cash? Okay, convince them to change their ways.
Yeah. So it's a great question. You know, probably the biggest power we all have is the money that we spend. every time you take a dollar out of your wallet and you buy a product, you're not just purchasing a product, but you're voting for the institution that made that product. And most of us don't think about the values we're supporting when we make those purchases. So to start with, I would say, buy local products, buy fair trade products, buy products from responsible businesses. Because if you're Procter & Gamble and you see, a half a share change in Charmin toilet paper, you know something's up. Secondly, let companies know. Believe it or not, I mean, businesses basically figure that roughly, if they get one phone call from a customer, there's probably 1,000 people that felt the same way that didn't make that phone call. So if 10 people make a call and say the same thing, you're communicating the value of almost 10,000 people. And I'll tell you, when they get 100 calls or 200 calls about the same thing on the same day, their red sirens are going off on alert. So you gotta speak up. You gotta let them know when they do something that you like or you don't like.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So, as you just mentioned, firms usually won't just wake up in a day and say, "I will screw up the world," but the corporate irresponsibility seems is the more dominant than responsible corporate behaviors these days. So, who do you think we should blame that for? Is it majorly the manager's responsibility for that, or is the investors in the capital market, or is because of the institutional settings in the countries? So if we want to improve the corporate responsibility, where should we start?
So I would say the single most important thing we have to do is get money out of politics. Because what's happened in this country is hundreds of millions of dollars flow from business to support politicians who enable legislation that institutionalizes and encourages bad corporate behavior. So you have to look at the whole system. And the problem is that in many ways we've created a system that rewards companies who do bad things. And so specifically, we want to overturn Citizens United because Citizens United is probably the worst decision that the Supreme Court ever made. And it, legalizes an additional flow of money into the political system. So I would say that's where we have to start because it's not that individual companies want to be bad, it's that we've created a system that encourages bad behavior.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
I have three things. One is I'm a long-term customer of seventh-generation products.
Thank
Yay,
you.
seventh-generation.
Thank
They
you.
are expensive.
Depends where you shop.
At the People's Grocery in Manhattan, Kansas. The second thing is I think of Equal Exchange as a responsible company because of their advocacy for fair trade.
Yep.
And then the third thing is really a question. Do you think that the federal government still has a role to play in ensuring a more kind of equitable and sustainable business community? And if you do, what is that role?
Yeah. So I don't know of another way to change the rules other than through the government. And the problem is that today the government creates problems rather than solves them. So, if we think about the concentration of wealth, you have to understand the fact that the tax structure is designed to channel wealth to a very small group of people. It's only through legislation and through the government that we can change some of those things. Now, some of those changes can be made by the federal government. Some of them can only be made legislatively. But I would say that I'm disappointed in the lack of bold leadership that we see even with the Obama White House. I mean, he's got a lot of things on his plate, but I end up feeling disappointed. So we need a government. I mean, you know, one of the things that as a customer of seventh generation, one of the reasons why our bathroom tissue is so expensive, right? You think this guy's taking trash and making bathroom tissue out of it should be cheap, right? I mean, you know, he's using garbage. Well, the truth is that the federal government has, and has for the last several decades, subsidized the virgin timber industry with $1 billion a year. So the federal government builds roads, provides trees at a discount. So what they've done is they've made the price of virgin fiber and toilet paper made from virgin fiber artificially cheap because they subsidize it. Now, this is purely the federal government. The federal government could do the opposite. The federal government could subsidize environmentally preferable products instead of subsidizing the oil industry. I mean, Exxon used to get $1 billion a month in federal subsidies. $1 billion a month. This is a company that makes about $1 billion a week. Why in the world would the federal government subsidize a company that's making $1 billion a week with all that money? So there's huge opportunities in terms of the federal government to change the context and incentives that businesses have.
Just a follow-up, do you think that repealing Citizens United would have an impact on the way regulatory agencies act? I mean, it seems to me that almost every day I hear about a regulatory agency that's going to let Monsanto do this or Exxon do that, or that gives the banks a little slap on the wrist for stealing billions of dollars, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, that's a complicated question. I mean, they're right now trying to sue the EPA for being too friendly with the National Resource Defense Council. So, I mean, you know, there's an interesting lawsuit that's going on right now where the guy that was the biggest shareholder of AIG is suing the government for being too hard on AIG because they got an $80 billion bailout. So regulatory agencies are complicated. They're not necessarily good or they're not necessarily bad. A lot of it depends on who appointed those people, when they were appointed, and how they're managed. And you know, I think it in some ways, it goes back to this fundamental question of morality and ethics. And, you know, why are we here doing what we're doing? Are we here doing what we're doing for our benefit, for the benefit of our friends and peers? Or are we here to make this a better place for everyone? And one of the things that worries me the most is we've lost this civic notion that our fundamental responsibility is to take care of us rather than to take care of me. And it goes to whether you're a regulator or you're a business person, you know, almost whoever you are. We don't encourage and teach and support the kind of thinking that says, let me think about what's best for everyone, not just what's best for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
During your talk, you talked about traditional agriculture and organic agriculture. So the way you were talking about it, it seemed like you were labeling traditional agriculture as an inferior product to organic, and why so do you feel that way?
Yeah, so I don't want to say inferior, but I think that, and this is a complicated topic, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But there are fundamental parts of traditional agriculture, not just the use of pesticides and fertilizer, but what happens to our topsoil. Traditional agriculture has caused a tremendous erosion of our topsoil, where if we just compare it, you know, sometimes people think, well, eating beef is a bad thing because beef is an environmentally inefficient way to get protein. Well, one of the best things you can do is buy grass-fed beef, because by grazing beef on grass, you actually build up the topsoil, that topsoil sequesters CO2, and it undoes what traditional agriculture often creates problems with in terms of topsoil erosion. If you look at small-scale agriculture, and a lot of people think, well, large-scale agriculture is more efficient than small-scale agriculture. It's just not true. There's 500 million small-scale farmers around the world, and they are as efficient as many of the biggest large-scale operators. And so this is a complicated subject. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do. And part of it is that if there was a tax that was paid because you're destroying the topsoil, people wouldn't function the way that they do. And as I said before, if you want to use pesticides, well, then you should pay to clean up the mess and the groundwater that gets polluted. Part of the problem is, if you don't have to do that, well, it seems cheap to use lots of pesticides because someone else has to pay the cost of doing that. But you should feel free to disagree with me.
Well, I mean, you were talking about carbon emissions, or I mean CO2 emissions, but it's like 400 parts per million, something like that's what it's currently at. If you're using organic farming, you'd have to plant a much less population, I mean, to like grow a decent plant without using pesticides or herbicides. And plants use respiration, which takes CO2 out of the air. So I don't understand how you would say that large-scale farming adds CO2 to the air.
No, I didn't say that it adds CO2 to the air. What I said is that the erosion of topsoil takes away the sequestered CO2 that's already there. I'm not saying that large-scale agriculture does an inferior job of absorbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you have to look at all of the impacts. So you have to look at the energy that was used to make the fertilizer, the energy that was used to make the pesticides. You have to use the energy that was used to make and use the tractors. If you add all that up, the impact of traditional agriculture is way, way, way heavier and more adverse for the climate than traditional agriculture is. And then some people say, well, you can't feed everyone if you don't have traditional agriculture. And I would say that the facts don't necessarily support that. But it's a long debate. But thank you for questioning me. Other questions?
Talking about the economy, I guess, from your business point of view, how would this actually be, like, how would taxing the rich actually be helping inflation?
Well, first of all, I don't think we have an inflation problem right now. I mean, inflation is low, if not, too low. I would go further than saying we should tax the rich more. I would say that what we actually need is something that's called the wealth tax. If you're a wealthy person, you make on average maybe 10%, in a bad year 5% on your investments. I actually think that we should annually pay a 1% to 2% tax on that wealth, and that money should go back into supporting education and infrastructure and all the things that we don't have enough money to support. I would also say that we're spending too much money on defense right now. But I don't think the problem isn't inflation, and also the problem isn't that we have too much debt. I don't think that the notion, as many people will say, that we have too big a debt burden in our society and our economy, and that's bad for our economy. I don't think it's true. I think actually at a time like this, we should have as much, if not more, deficit spending to get the economy going. But that's a contrarian perspective.
And also, when you say the wealth tax, are you saying that it should come from the 200-plus year or more, or are you just talking about the big businessmen that make over billions?
I'm saying that if you've got $5 million or more in assets, you should pay in addition. See, the reason that Warren Buffett pays so little taxes is that he basically has virtually no earned income. All of his income comes from his investments. And we tax investments at a much lower rate than we tax income. So if I've got $100 million sitting in the bank and it's earning 10%, I'm paying a 15% tax on that. If you're making $50,000 a year, you might be paying, depending upon where you live, 30, 35%. There's a lot of people who are making small amounts of money, but end up paying way more in taxes than people that have a lot of money. So we have to address both parts of those issues.
Thank you.
And what I'm arguing for is raising the taxes on myself, which my daughter doesn't always like to hear, but the reality is there should be less money left for her and more money that goes back into society.
Okay, so in reference to the increase in book costs and tuition and the education system as a business model, do you think that the education system in America is actually socially responsible? And if we move towards providing free education for our students like other countries are doing, do you think our economy can even support this?
Yeah, I think it absolutely can. First of all, the burden that we're placing on students is a disaster. We will succeed as a nation because we make it so desirable and so cost-effective for people to be students that they don't have to spend time asking the question of whether they can afford an education. So, in my opinion, education should be free, as should health insurance. How do you fund that? You fund that by things like a wealth tax. You fund that by raising taxes on wealthy people. You fund that by taxing bad business behavior. We need a carbon tax. We need to tax bad things and invest in good things. Right now, we make the good things like education too expensive for most people. How can we, as a country, compete with the rest of the world when we make it so expensive for people to go get an education? I mean, you look at it, I think India has 10 times as many people studying engineering as we have, and China has 100 times as many people studying engineering as we have. I mean, the careers that will determine the future success of our country, we're not investing in and making accessible. So I think that we're deeply headed down the wrong road, and it's not that there's a lack of money. I mean, personally, again, the amount of money we spend on the military is way too high. That money, some of that money is better spent on education.
So do you think education really matters then for making socially responsible individuals?
I think it does because where else are you going to learn about this stuff? Where else are you going to learn about systems thinking or externalities or all these things? I mean, a not well-educated society makes bad decisions, uninformed decisions, isn't able to think in a long-term perspective, acts in a very short-term perspective. And that's the way we're hurting ourselves. I mean, the damage that we see around us, whether it's inequality or negative impact on the environment, it's all self-inflicted. No one did those things to us. We've done those things to ourselves. And so you have to think about, well, why did that happen? And I think the reason that it happened is that a small group of people with a lot of money have an undue influence over the system and have, over the last 30 to 40 years, designed the system for their benefit to the disadvantage of most people. And amazingly, we've let it happen. I don't know why we're not out in the street, raising hell because of all the crazy things that are happening. I mean, I was at the climate change march in New York a few weeks ago with my kids, and it was the most hopeful thing that I'd experienced in a long time. They thought 100,000 people would show up, 400,000 people showed up. And I'm like, maybe we're waking up. But in some ways, we're almost in this deep sleep where all of these bad things are happening, and we're just sort of hoping that they're going to go away. And they're not going to go away unless all of you are spending time every day making sure that we change the path that we're on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last question.
All right, Mr. Hollender, thank you for coming to speak. My question is pertaining to your question and answer. Actually, at one point you referenced a decrease in government regulation, more of a free market system, but in many other points you've referenced more regulatory agency action. Which of these would you think is more important?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry if, in general, it's hard to talk about all regulatory influence being equal. So are there parts of our economy that are over-regulated? Probably. But generally speaking, I'm concerned about under-regulation. Generally speaking, I'm concerned about what happened in the banking crisis. How was it that we let banks make loans to people who they knew couldn't pay them back? How is it that the Environmental Protection Agency isn't able to protect the environment? I mean, why do we have an Environmental Protection Agency that then is prevented from doing what they're supposed to do? So I am an unusual business person. Most business people hate regulation, and most business people will say regulation hurts profits, it makes us less competitive, it makes us less effective. And I would argue that in most cases, not all, the opposite is true.
Thank you.
Yeah. So unless someone's got a really impossible, embarrassing, difficult question, which I would gladly take, no one wants to rise to that challenge? Yes.
Cool glasses.
Oh. So I got these glasses online. You know, it's what's the name of the company? I'll look it up in my phone and tell you. But they're reading glasses. They're not prescription glasses. But I'm a big Warby Parker fan. But they don't make this particular. Do people know Warby Parker? So if you want to get prescription glasses, you can get them at half the price that you would normally pay. And they do this amazing thing. They'll send you 5 styles of glasses for you to try on. And you send the 4 that you don't like back, and you keep one of them, and you spend half as much money. And they're a very cool company. So, and I don't own them. I don't have any interest. What?
Do you know that those glasses are ethically made?
They are more ethically made. They have an amazing program around the world for vision. I don't know who's grinding the glass, though. But anyway, I don't know why I did an ad for Warby Parker, but they're a good company. So anyway, thank you very much. Again, you missed part of the baseball game. I hope it's going your way, but thank you for coming to the game.
Mr. Hollender will be signing books at the back if you're interested in purchasing one, and you can visit with him further there for about another 15 minutes.